Well, good morning and happy Mothering Sunday. And I do hope you're keeping well. And this morning we want to celebrate motherhood and the mothers we know amongst us, all those who have a mothering role in our community and beyond. Every one of us has had a mother, and we want to celebrate motherhood today. Because mothering is not just about providing care and support and love, which obviously it is, but it's about the foundation of life that mothering generates, that our lives are built on the security of what our mothers have given us in our early years. And we want to celebrate that today. And if you're out there and you're listening and you're a mum, well, we're going to give you a round of applause now. So are you ready? 1, 2, 3, yay! There you go. I hope you joined in with me there. Well, this is the first of our video talks while we're all under lockdown with coronavirus, and I hope you're able to access it straightforwardly. And today we're looking at a song, a psalm about motherhood, and it's written by David, who was a shepherd, became a soldier and then a king, and he was also a musician, composer, and he wrote songs. And this song is in the book of Psalms in the middle of the Bible, and it's Psalm number 131, and it's about the security of knowing that you have a mother whose arms you can jump into. So let's read that together. So it's Psalm 131, and I'm just going to read that now. So, Lord, my heart is not proud, my eyes are not haughty. I don't concern myself with matters too great or too awesome for me to grasp. Instead, I have calmed and quieted myself, like a weaned child who no longer cries for its mother's milk. Yes, like a weaned child is my soul within me. O Israel, put your hope in the Lord, now and always. We live in a restless world, and our lives are marinated in restlessness. And what we're thinking about today is, how do we find peace? How do we find rest in a restless world? I want to take you back to the early 1990s, a visit to the Science Museum with Dave and Will, our sons, probably about 8 and 6 at the time, with Rosalind, their mum, and myself. And it was quite near the beginning of Launchpad. I don't know if you've been to that at the Science Museum, where there's lots of hands-on activity. And in the centre of it at that time, there was probably about 2 metres square, a great big table with edges to it, and it was filled with grain. And around the edges there were various devices to move the grain around. So there was like conveyor belts or little buckets on a chain, or like an Archimedes screw, all sorts of devices to move the grain along. And every device had a little handle on the side of the table, and there were lots of children using child power around the edge of the table, turning these handles crazily to move the grain from the right-hand pile across to the left-hand pile. And they were beavering away. And both Dave and Will got quite involved in this and were quite hooked on it, really. And it got to the time when we needed to make our way home, catch the train and get back home. And this took quite a bit of persuading. It's quite a while since we had young children, but persuading young children can take quite a lot of persuading sometimes. And anyway, we need to go now, sort of probably did the counting down and all that. And eventually we got to the point where, I can't remember if it was Dave or Will, said, I will when I've finished. Beavering away, trying to get this grain from the pile on the right to the one on the left. And what they hadn't seen was a bird's eye view of the table. You could see that that grain was never going to be finished. Their job was never going to be finished, because the grain was just going round and round in a circle. And for me, that spoke into my life actually, and still does, that sometimes I only permit myself to rest when I think I've finished. But in reality, that never comes about. We're never finished. And that really spoke to me at the time, that actually I needed to stop and rest. And when we look at this psalm, there's only 3 verses in it. And looking at the first 2 verses, verse 1 and verse 2, really give a contrasting approach to finding rest and peace. Verse 1 says, "Lord, my heart is not proud, and my eyes are not haughty." Really, that's proud is where you undervalue people around you, and being haughty is where you overvalue your own capabilities. So what David was trying to do, although he said he's not doing that now, but presumably he used to work that way, was trying to find a rest or a contentment by separating himself from others, by creating a relative difference between himself and others. And we can do that too. And I'm just thinking about this. Sometimes we do it in terms of our performance. It's the quantity of things that we're doing. We try and steam ahead, get more done, achieve more, do more with our house, do more with our kids, do more with our cooking, whatever it is. We try and outperform people around us to try and give us breathing space, if you like, that actually I'm okay, I've outperformed other people, but actually that never really works. And we also do it through perfection as well, not just performance, but we do it through the quality. We think, if I just get this absolutely right, then I can be at peace. And speaking as a workaholic perfectionist, I resonate with both of these aspects of thinking that this is the way to find rest, this is the way to find peace. And one of the difficulties with perfectionism is that your aim is always beyond your capability. So even if I do this video, which I won't, perfectly, it still won't quite be good enough. Because a perfectionist is never satisfied with what they've done. And that's what drives them, and it's something we have to let go of. And the other way of trying to find peace, there's performance, perfectionism, and the other is precision. We find peace by knowing more, increasing our knowledge, filling our minds with knowing about whatever we need to know about everything. And there's such a lot of access to information now with the internet. And somehow we feel, if I just know more, I can feel more secure and at peace. And I think the difficulty about all of these things, pleasure will be another one as well. Sometimes we might think I can find peace through pleasure, but that's just a passing pleasure, passing satisfaction. And the difficulty about all these things is that they are all embedded in myself and in my performance, my perfection, my precision, my pleasure. And to be honest, they are all dead ends. Because the only place that we find security, the only place that we can find peace, the only place we can find rest is in relationship. It's always in another. If we try and find these things in ourselves, it's a lost cause. We have to find them in another. And this is what David discovered. He'd given up on all those dead ends, try and sort it out in myself. My heart is not proud. My eyes are not haughty. I've given up on that. I don't concern myself with matters too great or too awesome for me to grasp. Instead, I have calmed and quieted myself. Literally, I have made level. I've muted. I've silenced myself. Like a weaned child who no longer cries for its mother's milk. Yes, like a weaned child is my soul within me. That's a beautiful picture, isn't it? And I think it's key, the fact that he's described this child as a weaned child. That means they're no longer feeding on breast milk. They're on solids now. And I don't know if you know the difference. We've got young grandchildren. If one of them, say, is still breastfeeding and she's in her mother's arms, she will be restless often. Certainly if she's hungry, she'll be going like this, rooting out, trying to get the milk. And there's a restlessness if you're going just to get milk. But a weaned child can rest in their mother's arms in a deeper, more secure way. And this reminded me of a time chatting to Dion, who's a member of our church family. And he was facing challenges at the time. And he described the difference when you move from believing in God to trusting Him. And it's a subtle difference, but often when we're believing in God, we're focusing on an outcome, something that we're believing God for. And if that doesn't come through, well, all is lost. It's a bit like the child only seeking the milk when they're in the mother's arms. Just imagine if a child was a weaned child and just ran away from that mother's arms. I don't want this. There's no milk here. It's no good for me. But Dion was saying there's a difference when you move from that to actually, okay, whatever happens, I will trust Him. Lee and Ruth are a couple in our church who were looking for a house, and Ruth used to come along to our Babies and Buggies group. This was about 3 years ago, and at that time they were looking to move house. The house they were in at the time was really too small for them and their 3 children. And I remember going through the possible houses came up on the when they were released on Wednesdays on the housing list, and we'd be praying and believing for this house or whatever it was, or maybe they'd believe for going up the list, being able to view it, but maybe it didn't come through. And we went through that sort of cycle a few times, and then Ruth, I remember got to the point where she said, well, I've got to the point now, we're just going to trust God in this. He's got it in His hands. He knows the house He wants for us. It'll come through at the right time. And there was a beauty about the peace that came upon Ruth and the family at that time, that instead of a restless believing, trying to get the milk, if you like, they were like a weaned child in their mother's arms. They had taken a rest and a trust in God that was beyond just for what He can do for me. Actually, He holds me securely in His arms, and He is a good God, a good Father who wants to do the very best for me. And that, as you know, is what's happened. They've now, 3 years on, recently moved into their home, which is just fantastic. And that's been a beautiful thing to see. Ultimately, as I said, we can only really rest in relationship. We rest in another. We rest upon the work of another, because rest is dependent. We rest in. We rest on. It's not a state of mind. It is resting in the work of another. So we rest on someone who is resting. We have peace because we're in the arms of one who is the Prince of Peace. We know love because we are in the arms of one who loves us beyond measure. I'm going to read a passage that talks about that in the book of Hebrews, which was a book in the New Testament. That's the part of the Bible written after Jesus was born, and this is specifically to the Jewish Christians, people who became Christians who were previously Jews, and it talks about God resting. I mean, that's a crazy thought, really, isn't it? That God actually rests. And why does God rest? God rests to create a space within which we can rest in what he has done. This is why he was so crazy about the Jewish nation observing the Sabbath. That was a rest day, so they could actually live out the reality of resting in what God had achieved for them. So I'm just going to read a few verses from Hebrews chapter 4. So literally just the beginning and end of it, really. So here we go. That's why, as long as that promise of entering God's rest remains open to us, we should be careful that none of us seem to fall short ourselves. And then it goes on in verse 14. Since we have a great high priest, Jesus, the Son of God, who has passed through the heavens from death into new life with God, let us hold tightly to our faith. For Jesus is not some high priest who has no sympathy for our weaknesses and flaws. He has already been tested in every way that we are tested, but he emerged victorious without failing God. So let us step boldly to the throne of grace, where we can find mercy and grace to help when we need it most. One thing I find beautiful about that image of being like a weaned child is that the feet aren't on the ground. I think sometimes we like to trust God sort of half, still have our feet on the ground, but a weaned child is in the arms of its mother. And there's something about that here in this last verse. So let us step boldly to the throne of grace, where we can find mercy and grace to help us when we need it most. And this chapter, which I haven't read the whole of it, but it focuses really on three areas where God has rested. Focuses on his creation, that God created the world in 6 days in the narrative in the beginning of the book of Genesis, and then he had a day when he rested. It was completed. And if you like, we live in that rest of God. We wake up in the morning, the world is here. We step out of our front door, if we're not self-isolating, and the world is there. We don't have to make it happen through some effort of our will. It's there. We rest in what God has created. Another rest that he talks about here is the rest of the promised land for the children of Israel. They've been freed from slavery in Egypt, and God had made a promised land, and it was a gift to them to enter into, but they didn't choose to do that and wandered around in the wilderness for a while. But the reality is that there was a place they could step into, if you like. There was almost like a lap they could climb into and find rest. And the third is the rest of what Christ has done for us. Remember, the very last cry when he was on the cross before he died was, "It is finished." I don't know if you can imagine him, as it were, holding you with him there. All that our failings, all of the things where we've messed up, all of our weakness, all of our inadequacy, all of our rebellion. He's holding us with him, and he's crying out, it is finished. There is a completeness in what Jesus did on the cross that allows us to know rest in Him, in God. Let us step boldly to the throne of grace. Grace means gift, where we can find mercy and help when we need it the most. That is where we find rest. We find rest in another. We find rest in relationship. We find rest by coming to Him and knowing that there is a place prepared for us to find rest. In 1939, the nation was facing a deep challenge. And this was at the beginning of the Second World War. At that time, we've probably seen the film The King's Speech. King George VI had a stutter problem, and that's about him overcoming that when he had to give the first speech at the beginning of the war. But then later on, about 3 months into the war, he was going to have to give the Christmas broadcast. And at that time, his eldest daughter, Lilibet, or Elizabeth, who is our queen, but at that time she was 13 years old. And it's mentioned in this book that came out when she was 90 years old. I don't know if you've seen that. The Servant Queen and the King She Serves. But when she was 13, she went up to her dad and sort of pulled his coat tail. And this is what they say. At that time, Elizabeth was 13 and the family was still living in Buckingham Palace. She handed her father a poem by Minnie Louise Haskins that she thought might be helpful. She was right. It is indicative of the Queen's self-effacing modesty that she does not mention that fact in her foreword to this book. What mattered then and still mattered to her now is how the words helped others. And indeed it was the lines from that poem that stirred and strengthened the hearts of millions at that terrible time. And I thought, just as I draw to a close, I wanted to read that because it resonates so much with what we've been thinking about in this Psalm of David. And we had a great friend actually, Sheila, who used to come along to a midweek group of ours we had some years ago, and she had a slight memory problem. And she had this because she was alive in the Second World War. Her house was bombed. And she had this prayer poem in her Bible. And every week she came along, she used to say, "Oh, I've got this, I'd like to read it to you." And it was such a precious thing. Lovely, lovely lady. And I'm just going to read it to you now. I said this to the man who stood at the gate of the year. Give me a light that I may tread safely into the unknown. And he replied, go out into the darkness and put your hand in the hand of God. That will be to you better than light and safer than a known way. Let's pray. Father, I thank you that your arms are wide. Thank you that you have prepared a place of rest, security and peace. Lord, that your cry over our life as we come to you is, it is finished. And Lord, as we face this profound challenge to ourselves and our nation, I pray that in our innermost being we would know your grace and peace at this time. In your precious name we pray. Amen. Thank you.